trend for states to recognise that marriage is no longer exclusively a wholly monogamous union between a man and a woman. We see that there's now a more liberal understanding of what marriage is and what the state should take marriage to be. As such, ladies and gentlemen, we're here to propose that anyone, man or woman, over the age of 18 who's of competent and sound mind and doesn't mind getting married, may be married to as many people as they want, whoever they want, and however they want to get married. Ladies and gentlemen, I've got 2 points that I want to talk about today. I want to talk about why the state doesn't have a role in marriage, why marriage is a private union, and secondly, how we go about preventing abuse in these relationships. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, on why the state doesn't have a role to play in marriage. Well, we say that marriage is essentially the union of people. Now, whether that's 2 people or whether that's more than 2 people, we think marriage is essentially about love and commitment. We think it's about people who are in love with each other and who want to make a legally recognised commitment to each other should have the right to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, why do we think that's right? Well, inherently we think that they have the right to happiness and to express that will however they want. But secondly, we see that there are economic benefits of getting married, and inherently that the state often thinks that it's just good to get married, and because of that, people shouldn't have that opportunity denied to them on the basis of who they seek to love. Ladies and gentlemen, we say that the state should support these relationships because inherently they are strong and committed relationships, and we think that's inherently good because it creates a stable environment in which children can be brought up in, and we think that that's a great environment for the kids to come up in. Whether that's the traditional one father, one mother situation, or whether it's a family with 1 father and 3 mothers, we don't think that undermines the stability that family unit can create for children. Ladies and gentlemen, we see that because of the stigma that is attached to polygamy, people just don't make these decisions lightly. When they want to enter one of these relationships, they've given it due consideration and care. We say it's a serious decision, and we say they've thought about the partner, but not just the partner that they're marrying, the entire family that they're marrying into. They've thought about the relationships that they would have with other people. We say that people getting married aren't inherently dumb, and they're not just doing it because. We believe that there's a whole range of reasons, and we say often that this is either the religious or cultural norm for these people, and we shouldn't deny that to them. Just because it doesn't match everyone's values doesn't mean that that's a reason to deny it. And we say that many of these groups think that big family is the norm. Just because we have these Western ideals of monogamy, that doesn't mean that's the ultimate good. And we say that the state needs to respect the freedom of choice. And we've seen this increasingly with homosexuals, where if that's your choice, then that's great, all power to you. Ladies and gentlemen, we say that provided you're old enough to marry and it's a free will, then that's okay, and I'll take you there.
Madam, how is it fair to the first wife when the husband goes and marries a second wife?
Well, we say often in these cultures and these religions, it's not just out of the blue that a husband's like, oh, we're actually going to get another wife added to the family. We say that often it's a situation where that's an already agreed to term, that it's not like polygamy sprung upon you. It's something that you come to expect, ladies and gentlemen. So we just don't think that argument stands. So ladies and gentlemen, I want to look about the state and how the state undermines the role that it's meant to play if it doesn't actually allow these relationships. Ladies and gentlemen, we say that people deserve the right to happiness, and that's something the state needs to go about ensuring. And we say that even if they can't give everyone new TVs, they can at least give families the right to pick partners who they think are appropriate for them. And ladies and gentlemen, we think secondly, more than just denying happiness, it also denies particular religious freedom, but more than just that, it also denies cultural freedom. We say that particularly in circles such as in the Islamist culture, it's something that they aspire to, and it's something that they've grown up believing is inherently good. And we think it's unfair to deny that group just because it doesn't necessarily fit in with the mould that everyone else has grown up expecting. We want people to enter these relationships if they so believe so, and are taking their meds.
Even if marriage isn't the purview and the problem of the state, isn't it the role of the state to ensure that firstly people can consent to this, but also to ensure that no harm comes to an individual who enters into marriage?
Yeah, absolutely, ladies and gentlemen. And that brings me to my second point about preventing abuse, because we don't think inherently or instinctively that these are abusive relationships, which we've just heard from Meredith. We say that abuse happens in many relationships to begin with, and we think it's unfair to taint polygamous relationships as inherently having some kind of abusive circumstances. But we say that on preventing abuse, we can do so if we make polygamous marriages recognised by the state, and the state's actually able to monitor these relationships and intervene if they see that they so need to. We say that when it's illegal, these situations get pushed underground, and it's harder for the state to monitor. It's harder for them to intervene if there are situations of abuse. And we think that the exploitation that could potentially occur in these relationships, just with every other relationship, ladies and gentlemen, is kept much worse. But ladies and gentlemen, it's not just about intervening in a relationship if something gets bad. If the relationship comes to a natural end, as many do, and it happens in polygamous relationships as much as it does with straight relationships or homosexual relationships, ladies and gentlemen, we say that if there's a divorce in polygamous relationships, women or men in those circumstances, because they're not in a legally recognised circumstances, have incredible problems getting custody of children. We see that they have problems getting assets, which they have entitlements to. And ladies and gentlemen, they're not in a position where they can just go to an authority, they can just go to the family court and say, this is the situation with my family, help me fix this. Because they're not in a legally recognised relationship, they've got no opportunity of recourse, they've got no way of remedying their situation. And we say that's inherently problematic. And that's when you see abuses in these relationships start to come to the fore. We don't think that inherently these are abusive relationships. We see that, of course, abusive situations can happen, but by denying these people access to the regular sources, such as police if there's domestic violence, or such as the courts if there is a divorce, that's when you start to have real problems of abuse, ladies and gentlemen. Because we don't think the state has the right or the role to determine who can get married and under what circumstances they can get married. And because, ladies and gentlemen, we think that abuse in these relationships is problematic, but we can go about fixing that, we're happy to propose.
Mr. Speaker, we think it's all well and good for the state to move towards more liberal understandings and grant freedoms whenever it can be done in such a way that doesn't generate harms. But what we believe very strongly on the negative is that there are things that are not inherent in the fundamental abstract principle of polygamy, things that are fundamentally inherent in the way that polygamy is practiced by those who would and do choose to practice it. More than that, we do think that the state does have an ability to make a determination about what is the most stable and most productive family unit when marriage carries with it benefits and financial incentives in order to bring about these things. And that's why we believe very strongly that polygamy shouldn't be legalised. And just to point out, it's not even like there's a big problem right now. So, let's have a look at a couple of things that they said. What they told us firstly is that the state should stay out of marriage. And as I already told you, we think there are a couple of reasons why it's totally okay for the state to stay involved in marriage. Firstly, because marriage carries with it financial benefits. Marriage carries with it benefits of recognition and legal protection that comes from the state, and all sorts of things that help provide privileges and tax entitlements to people who live in that sort of a relationship. And that's why we think it's totally legitimate for the state to consider what provides the most stable family units and what provides the best environment for raising children when it comes to actively incentivising people. Beavis will talk more about that at second. But what they did try and tell us is we think it'll be just as good, right? That they're just as strong and committed. You know, whether it's 1 in 15 people or 1 in 1. Of course it's not as strong as committed. When, as Mel pointed out, like conceded to my POI, a lot of the people haven't even consented officially to live in these relationships with each other anyway. You're not telling me that is a stable, harmonious environment where people don't have any issues with each other. Finally, on the state saying out, she said people should be allowed to pursue their own individual happiness. What I'm going to tell you more in my material is that we think that in many cases, the people who are going into polygamy are not doing it out of a deep and meaningful choice that leads to their happiness. No thanks, Madeline. Secondly, in terms of religious and cult freedom, well, we think it is particularly these religions that are extreme and cultish that are the ones that attach with them the greatest harms in the practice of polygamy as it's carried out around the world. And more than that, we'll point out that it's not a religious obligation on people, it's a tradition, and we're more than happy to stop that for the interest of society. Finally, they talked to us about minimising abuse. And they said it was unfair to characterise polygamous relationships as being inherently abusive. Maybe, but the people who practice them and will choose to practice them in a state-sanctioned, officially polygamous marriage kind of way. And I'll talk more about that in my constructive. Then she said, well, we can monitor it better. It's difficult when you have underground official polygamous marriages unofficially. Well, let's point out for a second, you don't really get them. There aren't many active polygamous relationships in Australia. Because it is illegal, the vast majority of people who would be religiously inclined to do so don't do it because it's very hard to have a religiously recognised formally recognised by your community polygamous marriage and relationship that you keep entirely hidden from the state. And the people who are doing it are the ones who want to do it in a formal way, in a religious way. They don't do it. So you're talking about massively increasing the number of people who do it there. She then talked about the harms when marriage ends, how do you deal with custody, and things like that. Our point is the law's not black and white here. The law is more than capable of recognising that in most cases it's the women who are victims here, and helping them and making that knowledge available then through women's helplines that are targeted communities where this happens. Finn.
If the state is capable of judging the worth and safety of marriages, Victor, why ban polygamy? Why not just crack down further on forced or abusive relationships?
Because the principles that have been established in polygamy, firstly, are ones that don't mandate consent for everyone. Secondly, we think are inherently stable, even in cases where they're not overtly abusive. And thirdly, they're more likely to be abusive. And because you can't ever crack down perfectly on abuse in the domestic environment, don't commit and create the environments where it's more likely to happen. 3 points. First of these is about that this is degrading to women, and that society has an absolute right to uphold its standards. Secondly, polygamy leads to real harms against women. And thirdly, it undermines consent for people in an institution that should be all about consent. Let's talk about why it's degrading to women. We think that overwhelmingly, regardless of what way they try and phase it legalistically, the way it's used is as men marrying multiple wives. And what matters to the way that society perceives women is not what the letter of the law says, it's the way that these relationships are exercised and the way that they are seen in the community. Why do we think it's degrading? Because it says that a man is worth multiple women. That is the obvious message when a man marries many women, and that is how it is seen. It says that it is appropriate for men to have multiple wives, to take after their needs, to take care of them. And of course that leads to an imbalanced perception of the relative worth of men and women in society when it's seen, because it is imbalanced by definition and is imbalanced in its practice. We think it degrades the importance of women in a society that has fought so hard and continues to fight so hard for egalitarianism, not just in the letter of the law, but in the way that people act towards women. You cannot permit things such as this. More than that, we think it is the right of society to uphold these rights for itself. We think that when it comes to balancing religious freedoms, we point out it's not a sin not to do it, it's just an entitlement. Point out, even in the US where they constitutionally protect freedom of religion, it's bad. It's degrading to women. Secondly, let's talk about the direct harms to women. As I already told you, let's be realistic about who will overwhelmingly take advantage of the system that they have proposed. It will be overwhelmingly those minority and often extremist religious groups that our first Prime Minister already identified for us. And those are the groups where there are incredible pressures on women to go along with the domestic standards that are forced upon them. But we think that it will almost entirely be these, also, because you're talking about the groups that are seeking official recognition. So the direct harm, right? One, it's overwhelmingly linked to cases of forced and arranged marriage in these communities, and also in religions and practices that are positive, unfortunately, in our outlook of abuse of women and negligence when it comes to wives within these relationships. Not only do they create a system where more people will get married in harmful polygamous relationships, there's also a problem in polygamy, in that the wives are often, within these systems, help each other to cope, encourage new wives to accept the burden of oppression that is placed upon them by the husband. And then what we would much prefer is them to reach out. There's direct harms to women physically, but there are also direct harms to consent. And that's my third argument here. We think, as was pointed out by Mel, it's not sprung upon them. They come to accept that it's going to happen. Exactly. It happens in religious communities where the expectation and where the burden on women to stay part of these communities is to accept the marriage dictates that are told to them by their elders and the men of that society, unless the law provides them an out and a safety. If you don't get the consent under their model to decide who you cohabit with, that's a major blow to consent, which is the heart of marriage. You don't get to consent to new women coming into that marriage and taking away the financial support that will look after you in future and look after your children. Women lose out big time under this, and they don't get to consent to the financial and supportive harms and the moral harms of this. Ladies and gentlemen, the state does have a right to involve here, not just because we can choose what's best, but because there are direct harms to women, society, and well.
Gentlemen, what was actually degrading to women in this debate was Victor's homogenous conception of the people who enter into these relationships. The idea that they inherently can't consent. The idea that these relationships are inherently degrading. Like, inherent is a great debating word because you don't actually have to prove anything to say it's inherent. At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, we say the state recognises a multiplicity of relationships. In any marriage, if I get married to TJ tomorrow, there's going to be a massive power imbalance. At the end of the day, we recognise the capacity of people to consent and make choices when the state provides very real benefits in making those choices, ladies and gentlemen. We think it's perfectly acceptable for someone to say, I'm in a loving relationship with more than one person, my ideal life will be unified by the bond of marriage for the rest of my life with these people. We're happy to defend the multiplicity of choices which people genuinely make across a range of relationships in society right now. Three issues. Firstly, does the state have a role in restricting marriage? Secondly, this idea of abuse, and third, and actually that's it. Firstly, does the state have a role? So what we heard from Victor is this idea that marriage has financial benefits, and we agree, but we say that doesn't mean that the state is in some perfect position to determine what a stable relationship is. We say the state recognises that it is an imperfect arbiter of what a strong relationship is. That's why even though we have a divorce rate of 45%, the state still provides benefits to marriage, because we recognise that when people are willing to make this significant commitment to another, the state should support that. It doesn't always need to work out perfectly, ladies and gentlemen, to justify that state belief, ladies and gentlemen. We say what the opposition is doing is really undermining the freedom of people to exercise their happiness and their religious freedom. What Victor said is, this is just like a cultural tradition. It's not in the Quran or whatever, so it doesn't really matter. We say, ladies and gentlemen, whether or not something is in a holy book doesn't matter to people, because your sense of how your life should be organised, of the best family dynamic for you, of the best way to raise your kids, is crucial to your happiness. It's crucial to your well-being. They undermine that by denying the choice of people that that's the best way the society should be organised, their family should be organised. In terms of consent, ladies and gentlemen, we said from Victor, people just aren't. And we didn't really hear what basis that was, ladies and gentlemen. We said we're happy to crack down on any form of abuse in the same way we crack down on abuse in any form of marriage, ladies and gentlemen. We reject this idea that people are forced and abused into these kinds of relationships. And we say if they're forced and abused into these kinds of relationships, that'll still happen if this marriage is illegal. The difference will be that the women who ultimately get discarded, ladies and gentlemen, after this, get no recourse to benefits, get no recourse to custody for their kids, ladies and gentlemen. That's a massive individual harm that occurs under their plan. And furthermore, on consent, we heard from the opposition that people are put under an expectation to get into this, ladies and gentlemen. We say that's just no different to any relationship, ladies and gentlemen, like any power relationship, ladies and gentlemen. We say that's just the status of a relationship, because people are within a cultural and family construct when they make the decision to get married. We still don't vitiate their decision to do that, ladies and gentlemen. And we say, moreover, people make this choice seriously, ladies and gentlemen, because there is that stigma against polygamy. This isn't something you just jump into, ladies and gentlemen. You decide to do it because you feel it's in your best interest, ladies and gentlemen. But before I move on, I'll take Victor.
Kieran, when these are communities that practice arranged marriage, how can you seriously tell me this is fulfilling the desires of multiple people to live together in happy consent?
This is fantastic. Okay, I have Indian expertise on this. The idea that an arranged marriage is automatically bad is ridiculous. There's arranged marriages all over the place. We're happy to support them. The reason for that is that people opt into that culture. We say, you know what, I'm going to give my parents the ability to decide who I get married to, because I believe that the legacy of my culture is that I can be happy within this framework. This is the way it's worked for a long amount of time, and that unifying families together can still mean that you're happy, ladies and gentlemen. We reject the idea that those marriages are automatically imperfect, ladies and gentlemen, on Indian grounds. So, on this idea of abuse, ladies and gentlemen. Now, in response to Victor's point, Victor had a couple of responses. He said, you know what, these relationships just don't happen because it's too hard to keep them hidden. We said, no, it's not, ladies and gentlemen. You should have a state ceremony. That's how you keep a polygamous relationship hidden, ladies and gentlemen. And you know what, we don't care if there aren't 100,000 polygamous relationships. The fact they exist, and the fact that women lose out because they're denied recourse to any state apparatus because they're not seen as having a legal relationship, is something we're not willing to stand for on the government side of this house. And you know what, and Victor said, the state can still recognise sharing of assets, but how, ladies and gentlemen, when they defended a construct of marriage which is completely premised on the idea that a man and a woman is superior, should get superior rights. They're not delivering the same value, ladies and gentlemen. And Victor said if there's abuse, you can go a hotline. But that's ridiculous, ladies and gentlemen. If you're in an illegal relationship, you're so much less likely to call a domestic violence hotline, ladies and gentlemen, to seek recourse, because you're doing something illegal, even being part of that kind of relationship, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's significantly harmful. I have 2 key points of argumentation. Firstly, why is this why this reduces the harmful stigma associated with polygamous relationships? And secondly, why is this a crucial sign of religious acceptance towards the Islamic world? No, thank you. So firstly, Why this reduces the harmful stigma associated with polygamous relationships. Ladies and gentlemen, we're realistic. We accept that passing a law isn't going to fix all the stigma about these relationships and that some people are still going to think it's weird. However, we still believe that this legalisation will have a major impact in diminishing stigma. Let's look at why that is. We said the current perception of polygamy is completely dictated by the media. The idea of like Mormon cults in the Midwest attacking children, ladies and gentlemen. What that does is it ignores the plethora of other relationships, polygamous healthy relationships, which can exist, ladies and gentlemen. If this is legalised, you get more open relationships, ladies and gentlemen. You get more depiction of these relationships and things like the media. That legitimises these kinds of relationships when people see these more. This is a crucial impact, ladies and gentlemen. Moreover, we say that when the government legalises something, that's a powerful signal that can spark social acceptance. In the same way the US Civil Rights Act, ladies and gentlemen, in the 60s had a major impact in sparking societal acceptance, because the government was saying, these relationships are acceptable, we support them. What are the practical benefits? This means that children who come from these kind of relationship structures where you have 2 or 3 parents, ladies and gentlemen, are seen as more normal because the government isn't suggesting that their parents are wackos for entering these kind of relationships. That's one benefit, ladies and gentlemen. Furthermore, this increases the normalisation of other minority groups because the state is stopping this, unified construction of marriages only between a man and a woman. The state is saying you can have a multiplicity of healthy relationships that are inherently harmful. Secondly, let's look at this idea of a crucial sign of acceptance, ladies and gentlemen. We said that this is often crucially linked to Islam, ladies and gentlemen. We accept that not all Muslims practice polygamy, but the point is, for many Muslims, this is seen as a crucial impact part of their identity, because so many people in so many Islamic countries believe that the best way of their cultural organisation and their family organisation is through polygamy. If the state makes this legal, that's a massive concession, ladies and gentlemen. It's rejecting the traditional Western taboos about Islamic relationships as being wrong, as being depraved, as being more prone to abuse against women in particular, ladies and gentlemen. That's a huge concession at a time where there's so much mistrust against Islam, ladies and gentlemen. We believe the state has a responsibility to take this action. At the end of this debate, we stand for not homogenising relationships, for recognising abuse when it exists and fixing it. We are very proud of that.
Mr. Speaker, for all Kieran's talk of inherent this and inherent that, let's have a look at the cold, hard status quo. The fact is, the majority of these instances involve a man in a dominant position over these women. The fact is, most of these women don't even give valid consent to additional partners joining the relationship, and there was no protection of that in the government's model. We're prepared to acknowledge that these relationships aren't homogenous, but what we do see under the status quo is that many of them have extremely harmful implications for undermining women's consent, for providing a stable home environment. We think those are legitimate reasons to oppose this. I'll be bringing you 2 points of substantive. Firstly, like the principle of marriage and why we see it doesn't apply to granted polygamous relationships. Secondly, how we look after the children, Mr. Speaker. Why polygamous relationships undermine the provision of the best possible family environment for raising a child. But firstly, 3 points of substantive rebuttal. Firstly, abuse. Secondly, stigma. Thirdly, Islam. Alright, so the government's contention has been that abuse happens all the time in all these relationships and that we can best counsel women by legalising it. That's factually not true, Mr. Speaker. What happens when a woman in a de facto relationship is being abused and goes to support services? She's always told, always told positive messages, is given support. Even if that didn't happen under the status quo with regard to polygamous messages, we think you change the law, Mr. Speaker. You make it easier to look after these women that are being abused, rather than broaden the possible spectrum and channels for this abuse to continue occurring. We think you defend against the harms without broadening the capacity for these harms to keep going. Secondly, we think there's a massively small underground movement that exists, that perpetrates this abuse to these women in any case. Legalising just broadens that channel rather than bringing any positive benefits. Primarily because it's such a minor part of the religions that Kieran wanted to talk about. Primarily because it's an entitlement and it's not a sin to not marry multiple women, and it isn't a core part of these people's religion. We think there's plenty of mechanisms to act with this under the status quo. We think that when it's a polygamous relationship, abuse is always going to be more likely, Mr. Speaker, because these wives are capable and do under the status quo. Just tell the new girl to deal with it. That this is how the relationship has been, that this is how it should be. We think in religious communities there is this message that women are not worth as much as men, Mr. Speaker, and we're happy to stand against this. Second point, stigma. Kieran's analysis was we disperse stigma. Well, Kieran, we want to see it stay.
Yeah.
Firstly, we don't think that like legalising automatically gets rid of stigma. We think that when gay marriage is eventually legalised, there's still going to be a hell of a lot of Bible bashes going up against that, so we don't think that just magically floats away. Secondly, we think we're fine for stigma to continue existing against something that is genuinely abusive and has tangible harms on so many levels. We think that truly open relationships where someone can consent is completely different to this kind of forced institutionalization. Finally, harms to Islam. And his analysis was that people will have a greater conception of Islam, will understand it more and be more in tune. No, Mr. Speaker. What is more likely to happen? People will suddenly understand a radical new notion that they've always regarded as strange and against society's norms, or they'll think Islam is strange, and Islam is a threat, and Islam is something that can't coexist within their traditional Western liberal democratic framework. We see this already with the burqa. It's a fear factor, Mr. Speaker. It's something that highlights the very differences that people won't accept, that people won't deal with, that people react violently to. We think we need to ban these kinds of things, and we need to ban elements like the burqa to make people feel more comfortable with Muslims in their own backyard. They're never going to understand polygamous marriage and faith hearing.
When the state is saying that your relationship is depraved and illegal, how comfortable are you going to be to approach the state when you've been abused?
We think that that's better than people who already go to abuse counsellors under the status quo when they have been abused. Secondly, we think that if you do legalise, you just broaden the channel for that abuse to occur, and you give it this state mandate. You say yes, this is perfectly fine for this relationship where the man has more power than the woman to exist. That just allows it to happen more often. So, principle of marriage. Why do we offer the benefits of marriage, Mr. Speaker? Because marriage is unique. It's a relationship that signifies commitment, and it's one that is given unique financial backing and support by the state. And it does this because it enables partners to financially support each other. It enables partners to contribute equally to society and to enable them to actualize their own conception of what's important in life. And it provides a stable environment for raising children, and it provides the best way to bring forward a society. There are problems with it, but it's been shown to be extremely effective in our society. So these polygamous relationships are going to be far more likely to break down, simply because when you have more parties to these relationships, you necessarily have more stressors, you necessarily have more factors that have to be juggled. We think that this means that it provides a much less stable environment, and as such, it shows that it's fundamentally not the ideal method for a familial unit. It shows that it doesn't deserve the same kind of protection as marriage does. No. But it also provides much more tangible harms, and it provides those harms to people that are most in need of protection. But before I do that, I'll take you there, madam.
Doesn't the very fact that we're having arguments here about the statistics within these marriages prove that the status quo has failed, and the only way to deal with abuse within these relationships is to bring them into the light for real scrutiny? No, we think you can deal with abuse in relationships under the status quo. You can deal with it already. What you don't need to do is just widen the ability for that abuse to occur, to make those relationships more legitimate, to increase the number of them, to increase the possibility for that very significant harm to accrue. So, harms to children. We think that, there's always going to be an environment of competition in these families, Mr. Speaker, because when a man has multiple wives and those wives have multiple children, there's necessary struggling over resources. And as a man marries more and more women, there's necessarily more and more competition for these resources. That is a harm in and of itself. We think it impairs the ability of families to substantively provide for their children in the first instance. But secondly, from the child's perspective, it necessarily impairs their vision of what a stable familial environment is like. Because it's now one of competition. It's now one where your 2, 3, 5, 8 mothers are competing against your stepchildren, against all those familial members. It's an environment that is substantially fractured. Secondly, we think there's always going to be a lack of paternal affection paid to these children. And while we acknowledge that there are many non-traditional parenting environments, this is one that already places masculine primacy, Mr. Speaker, because it acknowledges that the man is the centre of the familial unit. So when a man is dividing that attention among all these different children, those children are being deprived of the attention of a person that they have been brought up to believe is already the most significant figure in their household. We think that provides negative consequences to children on 2 levels, because now not only do they have a distinctly competitive environment, they have one in which the most important figure in their life isn't paying them the attention that they fundamentally deserve. So for all those reasons, we're very proud to oppose. About statistics, if banning polygamy works, he basically said, well, we can deal with abuse under the status quo. He's right. He's also right, but he said these women can go to abuse counsellors. But he's wrong about the effect of the status quo of polygamy. Because what the status quo for polygamy does is it drives these polygamous relationships into cults. So if you look at Utah, they're in extreme rural areas cut off from services. If you look at other countries, they lie about whether those marriages and those relationships exist. They hide them from the state because otherwise they get penalised. The result of that is cutting those women who are supposedly victims off from any of those services they wanted to talk about. I'm really talking about that throughout my speech because I think it's particularly telling that they wanted to talk about how these cultures are inherently abusive, how these men are inherently abusive, how these families are inherently abusive, but never wanted to engage with that abuse. They simply wanted to engage with the relationship. And all that does is theoretically limit the number of women these men can beat to one per man. That doesn't fix the problem. It doesn't even change the scale because if the cultures are so deeply ingrained in abuse, there'll be another man to do it. If that is the status quo that they set up, they failed to discharge their own burden. They failed to deal with the abuse that they saw as a problem. I want to deal with a couple of points of rebuttal. Firstly, how we prevent abuse, and secondly, I'm going to do them in the other order, the harms to children. I'm going to do the harms to children very quickly, because basically the harm that Beavis brought out was these relationships are inherently competitive because they're competing for affection. So is a family with more than one child. I inherently compete for affection with my brother. If I have step relations, I inherently compete for attention from those parents. All sorts of relationships lead to competition for affection and competition for attention. We don't ban those relationships. How do we prevent abuse? Firstly, is abuse inherent in the way polygamy is practiced? Well, no. Most domestic abuse statistics show higher links between Indigenous status and domestic abuse. We certainly don't have debates about banning Indigenous marriages. And we don't do it because it would be ridiculous to have those debates. What we do is have debates about how we prevent that abuse within Indigenous communities. And that's the kind of debate we should be having about abuse within Islamic communities. That's the kind of debate we should be having about abuse within Mormon communities. We should be having a debate about engaging those women and those men with the services that they need access to. That's not a debate we have, and that is the failing of the status quo. If we reduce this to the nature of the relationship instead of the nature of the abuse. I'm going to talk about this throughout my speech. And then they said, well, polygamy doesn't require consent from all partners because there are women who are already married to a man and then that man goes and marries someone else. Well, firstly, why wouldn't it require consent from those partners? If I want to have a relationship, and if I have a relationship with someone and I want children and they don't, I have to work that out with them. If I have a relationship and I want to have another husband and they don't, I have to work that out with them. If I'm failing to do that, I'm failing in my relationship. That's not a question of whether that nature of that relationship is good. It's a question as to whether I'm dealing with that relationship well. But secondly, that's when that woman maybe does go and get some help because she does feel like her husband isn't treating her well. We think that's a way we can do that. Finally, we also think if that was the analysis we use, then we'd ban marriage because it might lead to adultery. We'd ban things because they might lead to people not respecting the relationship. That's not how we work. We trust people to respect their own relationships, and when we don't, then we do it the consequences instead of banning the relationship. Yes?
American cults isolate themselves as much because they want to marry kids. Should we legalise that so it's easier to police too?
No. Of course not, because it's a very different situation. It's like how we don't allow people to marry people who don't want to be married, although it would probably be easier to identify those individuals because the marriage itself is invalid because someone's being forced into it. A polygamous marriage isn't inherently invalid unless someone's being forced into it or someone's being abused. When you put that relationship in the open, it's much easier to police and identify when that happens. So, moving on. They then finally said, I'm just going to move on to positive material. I'm going to talk firstly about the effect on polygamous relationships. And the first contention that we'll have is it's still going to happen. There will still be polygamous relationships.
Yeah.
We'd say that's because of the cultural significance, we'd say that's because of the personal significance, and we'd say that because we're actually having this debate at all. Those polygamous relationships are obviously still happening within our community. But the difference is, under the status quo, they happen in private. It's why we do raids in communities in Utah and arrest people, and then realise that they were married and we didn't even know about it. We realise that those communities, if polygamy is illegal, often these relationships have been going on for decades, and we have no idea until we happen to stumble across them that we should even be watching that community for polygamous activity, despite the fact that we made polygamy illegal. So those relationships are capable of happening underground. They do happen underground. We find out about them far too late to deal with those from anyone who might notice there was a polygamous relationship going on. When you can move those people back into the cities because they no longer feel inherently threatened, because they no longer feel that the state is out to get them and destroy their relationship or their way of life, you're more likely to be able to give those children that education, but more importantly, get those children in schools, when schools are often the first areas to pick up signs of abuse, particularly abusive children. Getting those individuals engaging within systems and engaging within services is the first way that we benefit those individuals. But the second thing that happens is that cults thrive. Cults thrive because they're able to tell people it is fundamentally true that the state is out to destroy our way of life. They're destroying the things that you consider culturally significant, so you should engage with our cult arrangement. Finally, what happens is that when those women do want to leave those relationships, they're already cut off from services. So instead of becoming cut off from services when the husband suspects something's going to go wrong and becomes abusive, they're cut off from the services right from when they first enter into that relationship. So when it goes bad further down the track, it's already far too late because they have nowhere else to go. Which brings me to my second point of extension, which is what message this sends when it comes to women's rights. Because the first thing it says is women aren't capable of making choices about the relationships they enter into. We have to protect them from themselves because they couldn't possibly be willing to enter into these relationships. That's a disaster when it comes to women's rights. Because those women aren't capable of choosing how to define their own sexuality. It says women aren't capable of choosing how to define their own personal relationships. That's generally bad. But it's even worse for these communities. Because when you're dealing with the kind of negative communities they wanted to talk about, the last thing we need is the state sending an additional message that these particular women, so women from incredibly conservative Islamic or Mormon backgrounds, aren't capable of making their own decisions. We need to be encouraging those women to recognise they are capable of making their own decisions and to make them themselves. Because it is bad for everyone involved, because the relationships haven't stopped and won't stop, because it's easier to regulate in the public eye. We are proud to oppose.
Mr. Speaker, members of this House, the harms that accrue to polygamy and the lack of consent that comes with it is much more likely in polygamous relationships. It need not be inherent for us to recognise that the greater degree and likelihood of harm means that we should set a higher bar to consent, and if that consent can't be guaranteed, then we should intervene preemptively. We're going to look at that in extension by looking in specific detail of what the exact harms that we're talking about are and why the types of relationships that we're talking about are more likely to have those harms and less likely to be able to consent to those harms. And lastly, as part of the extension, why criminalisation is important. But by way of introduction, I just want to say something quickly, which is, who are we talking about in this debate? And the opening government did a great job. Kieran said, you can't just use inherent, so he replaced it with multiplicity. He said, there's a multiplicity of these kinds of relationships. It's not all abusive Muslims and Mormons. You're right. But we think the majority of the people that we're talking about in this debate who are likely to engage in this are going to be Muslims and are going to be Mormons because they're the only people who have an impetus to do this rather than just the idea that it might be a good thing. Why is that important in this debate? Well, I'll show you in the extension, but what I'll show you is that one, these types of people in particular need to have special contextual requirements that must be addressed by the state. And secondly, the multiplicity of nice relationships, and then at closing what we heard was the women who will feel patronised by assuming that they are not choosing. Those are the vast minority, and don't ever let the government fool you otherwise. First point of extension. By the way, extension and rebuttal will be joined. First point of extension. What are the harms and why are they most likely? Two types of harms. First type, sexual or relational harms. We've talked a little bit about this, but what we're talking about is women having sex against their will, women getting hit if they don't have sex. We think rape is an awful thing, and it needs to be acknowledged in this debate as a significant risk, and one that need not be lightly dealt with by saying all relationships carry that risk. As we're going to show you, if certain relationships carry that risk in a much greater fashion, the seriousness of rape, of forced sex, of forced marriage needs to be considered. But we also think that there are relational harms, like having much less choices, right? Like the types of women who are in polygamous relationships, almost by definition, tend to be tied down into certain roles. The baby mother, the sex wife, or the domestic wife, or sometimes some magical combination of all three, which we like to call the narrative wife. She's got it all, gentlemen. We think that those particular harms mean that women have less choices to get an education, to get a job, to go out there. We think there are real harms. But here's the question. It's not about whether those harms exist. It's about why they're more likely in polygamous relationships. So let me go through them. First reason why they're most likely. These are closed communities. And we've had a furphy come through the government case, which is that these communities are closed because of the criminalisation of polygamy. And we completely deny that on the outset. We think they're closed for two reasons. Firstly, in as much as it relates to their polygamous relationships, because of the massive amounts of social stigma and shame and judgment they have to experience every day. that absolutely will not change in this debate, ladies and gentlemen. Legalisation doesn't make people feel like a certain relationship is more normal. We think they got the analysis on civil rights for African Americans absolutely backwards. It wasn't that they legislated and then a whole lot of people went with it. There was a million-man march and lots of white people ended up going along with it, and there was a sea change of public opinion, then laws were changed. We don't think they're just changing the law. If it's so contrary to what is considered the public norm, we'll just change that public norm. That's the first reason why these communities will remain closed. The second is because of the nature of these particularly religiously extreme communities. What we're talking about is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and some of the most extremist versions of Islam. Why is that important? We think it's important because for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they don't just set up their sects just because they're in polygamous relationships. We heard from the opening that they do so because they have sex with children. Most importantly, it's because they want to live by certain religious principles that are incongruous with the rest of society. That's why they publish their own newspapers, Mr. Speaker. It's called The Watchtower, and I've read it, and it was scary shit. Why is that important? Because you can legalise whatever type of marriage you want. They will stay in their sect, and the harms that Madeline outlined from staying in their sect will absolutely remain. Because of the stigma of their relationship, and because of the nature of their religious observance. We think that that is particularly important in this debate. The second reason why these harms are more likely, after looking at the fact that these communities are closed, is because of the backgrounds of these people. What we're looking at, as I told you, is particularly extreme versions of Islam and a particularly extreme version of Christianity. We think that particularly for Islam, what we're looking at is Islamic migrants. So in Melbourne, that's things like Sudanese migrants coming to Melbourne and having certain ideas of what marriage looks like and what the rights of women look like. We think it is these communities that need the most instruction about how to treat women, that need the most intervention on the types of relationships they can or cannot have, and need the least hands-off approach to let them treat women in a certain way. Not because they're dumber, but because they come from contexts where treating women badly and having sex without consent is more likely. Has nothing to do with their inherent nature, has everything to do with their contextual nature. For Mormons, it's their biblical context. Thinking certain things about women because of what the Bible tells you about Eve. Thinking that women have to do certain things like breed children, be housewives, because of what the Bible tells you. We think, Mr. Speaker, that because of the backgrounds of these people, the harms are more likely to be inherent. Because they come from certain countries and from certain ideas of religious background. Yes?
If these communities will always be closed, surely it's better that women in these communities have the legal right to access assets if they choose to leave these communities.
Yeah, we think that the Court of Equity will more than willingly give these women what they need, and if you think they're not getting the message, we're happy to put up a sign outside everywhere we possibly can saying any woman in any kind of relationship who believes can get divorce rights, but we don't have to legalise a whole type of marriage for it. Third reason why these harms are more likely for polygamous relationships, because there's a power imbalance between the genders, no matter which way you skew it. Why? Because if there's multiple wives, they can only get what they want, which is love, companionship, sex, and maybe even having a kid from one person. That is the husband. But the husband can get what he wants, which is sex, domesticity, love, companionship, Scrabble. He can get that from, theoretically, any number of the wives. Why is that important in this debate? Because he can say no much more than the women. Because if they say no, they have the ability to be denied what they want, which is love, which is a baby, which is companionship, which is sex. But the man is less likely to be denied those things. That creates a situation where consent is significantly diminished. Because these are closed communities. Because of the backgrounds of these people. Because there's a power imbalance in the genders, which means that some genders can say no more than others because of the numerical imbalance. Second, the harms to the perceptions of women. I already told you these people come from backgrounds that are more likely to be worse to women. That's why we think that leaving them on their own and hoping that they'll develop a better approach is wrong. This leads me to my final point of extension, which is, why is criminalisation so important? Because Madeline said, oh, it's still going to happen. We disagree. We think that criminalisation provides the perfect lever for prosecution and investigation of these communities. Why? Because the harms that we're talking about, like incest, like rape, and even more, like the perceptions of women being harmed, are invisible. You can't tell when a child has been raped if you don't have access to that child. You can't tell when certain people have views of women that are reduced. But a polygamous relationship is much more likely to be visible. You're much more likely to let slip about that. You're much more likely to be able to see that just when they walk down the street holding hands with one man and a whole lot of ladies. Why is that important? Because when you have a more visible harm, you use that as a lever to prosecute the whole community. Because of the context in which these people operate, they are more likely to do things like rape, like abuse, like force the women in these relationships. We need a lever to get into these communities. Criminalisation is the perfect one. These communities are more likely, and that's why we oppose.
Mr. Speaker, we found it really odd that, Amit was fine with these communities as long as it was only one woman that was being beaten in these abusive marriages, Mr. Speaker. As soon as it's two, that's when, there's a critical mass such that we should intervene in these communities, Mr. Speaker. But if abuse is ingrained in these communities, like Amit wanted to paint, Mr. Speaker, why not ban all marriages in these communities if they're so harmful? That could be a debate for another day, Mr. Speaker. But what we were doing were agreeing that these communities might be harmful. But, sir, that is the one reason that we on the government bench wanted to actually step in and regulate these communities, because that reduces the potential for people to be harmed in these situations. I'm going to first deal with rebuttal of the extension we just heard from closing, and then I'm going to ask what is the role of the state, and secondly, how do we stop abuse in these communities. So first I'm going to deal with the mixed material that he brought at extension at closing. What I would say is that, Amit acknowledged that there was like this multiplicity, as we termed it on government, but wanted to say that most of the people we're talking about were like Muslims or Mormon communities. So sure, why not? Let's accept that this is the case, even though we don't believe it is, Mr. Speaker. The material we brought you still stands, sir, and that is that we still want this stuff regulated, Mr. Speaker. All the material we brought you at extension was that all you do when polygamy is banned is that you force these groups underground, and they wanted to protect women and children in this debate and get them access to services, Mr. Speaker. We think that your potential to do this is reduced when these communities no longer exist, Mr. Speaker, because they have gone underground and you don't see them again, Mr. Speaker. And then Amit wanted to talk about the ingrained culture of these particular communities. We would say that, as I flagged in our opening, we would say that first of all, this is a reason to ban all types of marriages in these communities, and if that's what they want to do, they should have proposed that at the beginning of the debate, Mr. Speaker. But we would say that this isn't actually the main question in this debate. But finally, as I already told you, this is all the more reason to want a system of regulation to avoid the kinds of problems that they wanted to talk about. So I'm going to move on to my second point, which is what is the role of the state, Mr. Speaker. We heard right in opening that the role of the state is in deciding which relationships are stable and good for the family unit. Firstly, the role of the state is to ensure that people can live the good life, Mr. Speaker. We think that that's the first thing we want to point to on the government side. But secondly, if the state was in fact capable of judging the worth and safety of these marriages and the family unit, why are we even having a discussion about polygamy at all, Mr. Speaker? But Victor's response to this was to say that we should just crack down further on all situations in which there's high potential for abuse in marriages, Mr. Speaker. This wasn't good enough from opening, Mr. Speaker. If this was the case, why do we allow Indigenous marriages to continue when they have massive rates of abuse within those types of marriages, Mr. Speaker? But secondly, Victor wanted to say that the problem with polygamy was a lack of consent of all the partners, Mr. Speaker. That was the main problem he outlined. Firstly, we don't see why they can't get the consent. If a marriage is based on discussions, Mr. Speaker, we think that if there's a situation where this either works for the people involved or it doesn't, Mr. Speaker. That's why we have divorce. But secondly, we didn't know what they actually wanted to achieve in this debate, because if it was to avoid hurting first wives, Mr. Speaker, we would criminalise adultery if that's what they wanted to do. I'll take you there, man.
Given that these communities are more likely to be closed for contextual and for religious reasons, why are you willing to give these communities more women to beat?
I don't see it. There's going to be the same amount of people involved in these communities in the first place. What you do under your system, Amit, is ensure that there's actually no systems in order to go and investigate these communities. We don't see how you actually wanted to protect the rights of all the women in these communities by just targeting instances of polygamy when there is no evidence to suggest they're any more abusive. So this brings me to the last question I want to ask. How do we actually stop abuse in these relationships, Mr. Speaker? Opening wants to talk about how culture downplays women's rights. what we would actually, what actually happened in society, Mr. Speaker, we would say that first you encourage abusers sit down, to hide the relationships they have with these people, Mr. Speaker.
On that, sir.
We think that that's the first major harm of the model they want to outline. But secondly, we think that you encourage the whole community to hide underground, Mr. Speaker. So the first harm was at a base level of not being able to access doctors, for example, Mr. Speaker. But this is actually women and children, which is what we brought you at extension. Sit down. If these relationships are actually as bad as they wanted to claim, Mr. Speaker, we don't think they are. That's even more reason to know what they're doing at all points of their life, Mr. Speaker. We want this system to be more transparent, and because of those harms to first individuals, and secondly to the potential harms of people living in communities. But secondly, Beavis admitted that this take away all chance of regulation, all chance of ensuring that these people can live meaningful lives, Mr. Speaker. And because we think that the harms exist to both women, children, and these communities under their model, we're very proud to propose.
What our model does on opposition today is it gives police a reason to investigate before the worst harms occur, because polygamy is already illegal. That was the crux of our extension and didn't get a substantive response from Finn. I want to look at 3 questions at the end of today's debate. Should the state give you an unlimited right to pursue your happiness? Secondly, is there an inherent harm to polygamy? Then finally, how do we best control polygamy and stigma and all those kinds of other questions that are left over? So firstly and quite quickly, does the state give you an unlimited right to pursue your happiness? Because this was the principle that the opening government stood behind today, that the state should simply allow you this right. And while that right may exist, Mr. Speaker, it comes with limits, and that's the role of the government to ensure that harm doesn't occur to individuals. But the better analysis we heard here was that we're homogenising relationships. And what this language essentially said was that the state should recognise some kind of multiplicity of relationships. And the polygamy can actually be a good thing. But firstly, that assumes that you can have strong, consensual, polygamous relationships, which we told you very clearly can't occur because there are inherent harms to polygamy and harms that are much more likely to occur. But even if that was true, even if you could have relationships that gave the best love to the children and ensured that everyone got the right amount of care and attention, what you're doing on government today is legalising all polygamous relationships, where the state doesn't have any ability to step in and prevent any kinds of harms from occurring in that community. When you've acknowledged that the majority of people who are going to do this are individuals in closed-off, fundamental religious communities, we think that when you allow those harms to occur, you allow those communities to continue to be closed off. That's a problem. That's when that right ceases to exist. So secondly, is there an inherent harm to polygamy, Mr. Speaker? This is what we told you very clearly in our extension, is that harms are much more likely to occur within polygamous relationships. And these are threefold. Firstly, that consent is much, much harder to gauge when individuals are part of these relationships. Firstly, and like the government bench conceded, because this is tradition within these communities, these women are brought up to believe that this is a norm, and it's an expectation that's fostered in their family, from their partners, and also within their religion. Which they have very little choice, and there's very little dialogue about alternative options that exist for these women. That's particularly important when we're looking at incredibly closed-off communities, where these women don't get any access to alternative dialogue about the kinds of options that exist for them, and they have very little recourse in terms of those choices. But there are also considerable harms within that relationship. This is the specific analysis that Amit brought you in our extension, that there are less choices for women in terms of education and work, that there's incredible pressure on these women when there's somebody else who can provide your husband with sex, or provide your husband with children, but also that power imbalance continues to occur. But the real kicker, and the best part of our extension, well, in my opinion, Mr. Speaker, was the problems that occur within these communities when you continue to perpetuate problematic ideas of women. When you say that women can only have certain roles, as the sex lady, when you seem to be a childbearer or a homemaker, when there are specific roles that women have to fill. But also, what if the children are polygamous that see this and continue to see these relationships as acceptable and a norm within those communities? You don't have any options for those children. But the other harm is that the perceptions of these women and the powerful perceptions that occur within these communities mean that other harms are more likely to happen. You're more likely to see children being married to older men. You're much more likely to see incest and all those other harms occurring when you devalue the role of women. I will take closing.
Right. if a mixed analysis about these communities holds, these communities are going to be completely closed off to the outside world under either model, and neither model is going to help these women in closed communities in Utah. Why can make other people suffer?
Okay, so let's talk about closed communities. I'm going to get to this now, but to deal with it very quickly, the most visible way that we have the ability for police and law enforcement to stop problems occurring within polygamous communities is when we see polygamy occurring. And that's why you have the ability to stop in and stop other harms, but also it's an absolute assertion to assume these communities are suddenly going to become less closed off, and that's an analysis that Amit brought you. This is really what I want to deal with now in more detail. It's really where I want to spend majority of time in my speech, is how we actually control polygamy, ensure best outcomes, and deal with stigma. It all kind of works together. I'm going to step through it now. I'll take you over a little while, don't worry. Okay, so let's firstly talk about how we actually go about controlling polygamy. Because what we heard from Mel was it's much harder to interfere if it's illegal. We think that firstly that's untrue, because the problem actually comes when you don't have the ability to immediately know when you see a polygamous relationship if it's illegal or not, if there's actually harm occurring. It's much harder for police to be able to prosecute and control harms if you don't immediately know if harm is occurring. It becomes so much difficult to actually ensure there is some kind of enforcement. But Maddie extended this when she told us, well, it's always going to occur under the status quo, and we're not doing anything to control it. But what Amit told you in our extension is the best way to control polygamy, to stop these harms from occurring, is when it's actually visible. When you know, when you have the ability to see a crime occurring, and then go in and stop the crimes that are less visible. Things like incest, things like child marriage. You don't have any way of seeing those in those closed-off religious communities under the status quo. Kieran.
This marriage breaks down 50% of the time. Should we abolish marriage because it doesn't guarantee the stable family unit your opening says is the purpose of marriage?
Kieran, I don't give a shit about family relationship. That's not a deal in my point or in any kind of time. We think that stable family relationships can occur all the time, but polygamy isn't an inherently stable family relationship necessarily. Alright, moving on. So, let's talk about acceptance and whether or not women are actually more likely to come and seek help. Because what we heard from opening is that we're going to remove stigma and foster greater acceptance of these relationships. What we'd say firstly is that isn't necessarily something that we want to have. We don't necessarily want to incentivise these relationships. But more importantly, it was an absolute assertion these communities won't continue to be closed off, Mr. Speaker. And that's what Mick told you when he told in our extension, when he mentioned, thank you, that these communities want to seek a particular way of life, and they're going to continue to be incredibly closed off, also because that stigma goes away, because their religion is why they're isolated, Mr. Speaker. It's not because simply they want to pursue polygamous relationships. The fact they're committed to this way of life means they're going to continue to be isolated. What Madeline went on and explained was actually that the government has a role to change social policy, and that's absolutely untrue. The government doesn't have an ability to step in and mandate this change to occur. Stigma is still going to exist in the hearts and minds of individuals, and it's going to lead to any kind of greater acceptance, and he dealt with that in his point about civil rights. But how do we actually get women to seek help and get recourse? Because Maddie said we're going to get them to the cities and that's how we're going to get them help. Well, firstly, there's still going to be incredibly closed-off religious communities. Stigma is still going to exist. I've already brought you that analysis. These individuals are still going to fear their husbands and have this kind of pressure that is exerted upon them. But let's take it at its best point, which was they're not going to fear prosecution, so they're more likely to go to a doctor or seek some kind of help. We're happy to have some kind of non-prosecution clause for victims. You don't actually do anything to solve the problems. The stigma and the fear that these women feel will still continue to exist. Mr. Speaker, harms that occur from polygamy are far more likely to happen in these kinds of relationships. And they cause incredible harm to the women and these communities we proudly beg to oppose.
Thank you, everyone. Good debate, what we expect. I'm going to go through, and we have 4 results because this is also a round as well as the semi-final, and then I'll go through the reasons. So we gave first to closing opposition, so they go through the semi-final. And we gave second to closing government, so they go. Third was opening opposition, and fourth was opening government. And you get film as well to show your English. Our smiles are lovely. Yes. Lucas smiles in the Emmys. Okay, so I'll go through. We gave first to closing opposition for a few reasons, and it particularly also relates to why opening opposition doesn't come in the first half. And that is that the closing opposition are strong enough to fill in the gaps in what we thought was, particularly at both teams in the opening half, quite generic analysis. So the argumentation, particularly about the harms that were brought out in Amit's speech and then reinforced in Meredith's speech about the exclusivity of these communities, in particular how they were not exclusive on the basis of the illegality of polygamy, but in particular the types of things they believe in and their engagement with the community would never actually exist. On the effect of the background, which we I think probably treads a very fine line. It was quite a difficult argument to set out. I think some of the arguments as well were probably given more weight because possibly weren't responded to strongly enough as they could have. And the third about the power imbalance, which was, I think, again extended on Victor's, what we thought possibly was a bit of a simplistic mathematic analysis that 1 plus 3 equals 4 and 3 to 1 means that women are less than one man. The argument...
Tim.
That's weird. But the power imbalance analysis of the types of roles these women play and the ability of men to always have the power in those sort of relationships as opposed to the women. The second sort of additional extension about the ability of criminalisation and why you needed a Criminalisation Act. I think we thought that Meredith sort of made a very valiant attempt to make it sound more impressive than it was, in that it was more central than it actually was, and in fact it was given very little time in the extension. It just wasn't responded to in the material of Finn, and that's why there was an attempt to make it larger. We thought that was an okay argument, but if it was going to be made more central, particularly you were trying to break down this kind of criminal gang by finding some sort of law to break into them, that probably need to be made more central in the closing opposition extension. At closing government, and there was, I should have already said at the start, there was a fair bit of conversation about, probably after closing opposition, there's a fair bit of conversation for second on all three teams, the closeness between those three. The reason why closing government goes through is a few things. We think the extension on the role of government, again, does a very good job in extending the kind of internal structures that were missing at opening government. So why is there importance for a connection to the community? So all of Mel Matei's material, which was good, the regulation material, was given a far greater practical implementation position on the ability of those communities to engage with education, the ability of those communities, particularly women, to have those access. But what we also found, and I think what certainly brought a majority of the panel over towards the closing government side, is the analysis brought out an extension with regards to criminalising the act as opposed to criminalising the group. At times it may have gotten a little bit extreme. I think you took it probably too far to its extreme endpoint. The analysis say about Indigenous communities, about communities that were always going to have some form of abusive relationship internally. Why does it make any difference if that abusive relationship involves 1 as opposed to 3 or 4? And we thought that analysis was good, and there was, I think, a lack of probably response in the closing opposition's material with regards to that. What, though, made them first and me second was that the extension that Amit brought out in his material about the exclusivity of those groups certainly undermines some of your argument that if it were not illegal, they would have more interaction with the community, and we thought Finn probably could have a stronger job in setting out how that would change overall. In third, at opening opposition, there was, I think, particularly significant difficulty in the generic analysis that was brought out. That's the first thing. We thought, Victor, I think you did a good job in trying to say it's about these groups in particular. But say the first argument you had about women was a very generic argument which wasn't bedded down in that specific group of women you were trying to talk about. In addition to that, we thought that you almost added an extra onus onto the opposition, which was sort of shown out in Meredith's response to Kieran's point of information, which was these sorts of marriages are stable marriages, or the obligation that you tried to prove, particularly in James's speech, is that government should pick winners in relationships, and I think that sort of added obligation you tried to put onto yourself is something you don't need to prove, and something that we think was particularly difficult at times for you to prove in this particular case. And at fourth, again, at start the analysis is too generic, and that was borne out, I think, by the fact that you, as a team, fell out of the debate overall. And that was that the analysis about the multiplicity, the rainbow family aspect you wanted to make the debate out at the start. Every other team in the debate decided to make the debate not about that. In that they all accepted that that group exists, but that group was in a substantial minority, and therefore the rest of the debate kind of moves away. And again, that was kind of exemplified by the point of information that you asked, Kieran, in sort of a valiant attempt to bring back your material. I have an opinion that probably Meredith was a little bit too flippant in response to that, and should have given it a little bit more breadth in an attempt to show that there was an engagement across the benches, an explanation as to why you thought those particular people who choose outside that community should still have their act as illegal, and all that analysis existed in their own material. But in effect, that material was brought out because it wasn't bedded down in the types of groups that everyone else in the debate wanted to speak about. So that is the decision. If you have any more questions, please ask Tim, myself, or Michael. And thank you very much, and good luck to the team.